you introduce our topic for today and kind of the outline of what we're going to be speaking about?
Sure. Yeah. So hello, everyone. It's Bill Cope and my colleague here, Kristina Mitz. She's one of the therapists for us here at Taymount Canada. But also, aside from that, I wanted to give you a bit of an outline. I know we had talked about perhaps starting today at 2 o'clock, and that's my, I guess, flare up. You say, I just had a 3-day headache, and so I haven't functioned very well. I wanted us to also have the reason for having it at 2 o'clock was to have our guest, Dean Howcroft from Australia. So we're going to defer that to the very first part of Thursday at 2 o'clock. So we'll start at 2 o'clock this coming Thursday, which is April 30th. Yeah.
I don't know what day.
Final day of the month. We're pretty close anyway. So today, we've been talking about COVID, of course, with coagulation issues, and then we talked about PLA2. I'm happy to answer questions about coagulation and as well as PLA2. I think the biggest one currently from everything that I'm reading about COVID is it can be a real problem in many different organ systems. The brain, because sometimes it's strokes in very young people and they find out probably it was triggered by COVID. Liver problems, kidney problems, of course, lung problems about, and GI problems. So that's 5 organ systems, so maybe 20% each. I mean, that's kind of a ballpark, but it's indicative of that. And when you've got that many different organ systems involved, perhaps one of the most coming together or solutions to describe is a change in the blood flow. And the biggest, easiest way to change blood flow in a time of an infected illness is increased clotting, hypercoagulability due to fibrin. Fibrin is produced much more dramatically and taken away less well when you have a chronic illness. And this might be one reason that the chronic illness people are getting hit really hard. So that's diabetes, hypertension, heart disease, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, as well as even gut inflammatory problems. Okay, so maybe that's one of the key links, and that's why I've talked about nattokinase, which is an enzyme which is made from fermentation of organic soy. And this is, the one I talked about, nattokinase here in Canada by NAKAI is very much in that group. It will reduce the excess fibrin that 95% of chronic illness, so I'm pointing to myself because of my A, hypothyroidism, B, my MS, and I guess C, my severe osteoporosis. So it makes sense to me to look after some of that chronic problem. So because we know when we get an acute infection, hypercoagulability occurs. It's part of the body's response. So those are, I think, things we can fine tune and keep ourselves better with. We talked also, and we will go into it today, about glyphosate. So we're going to introduce the concept today. We're going to have a real live discussion with Dean Howcroft. He's okay. I checked with him. His came back when it was recently measured, was when he was overstaying in Canada. We sent it down to Great Plains Labs, and he was up in the 96, 97 percentile. So that's very high, which surprised him considerably. So he's working out that. So we'll get more from his story next week. I know a little bit what the glyphosates measure. I've had a couple of friends in the prairies, and they were in about the 70th percentile, which surprised them because they thought they were pretty conscientious. And then a young lad under 6 in Regina, his was up at the 96th percentile. His family ate pretty well, but, perhaps it's in the water. I would not be surprised it's intermittently in the water from the large amount that's used in our agricultural practices throughout Canada, United States, and certainly parts of the world, not all parts. It's maybe one thing that kept parts of Europe in better shape, like Austria and Germany, because there's much less glyphosate, because glyphosate's a risk factor, and we're going to tell you some of the reasons why. So the other thing I wanted to just touch base on a little bit is I want us to start to think to moving back towards normalcy. okay, the way things were. It's never going to get completely back to it, but we need to start thinking about it. You've probably seen the bits in the newspaper, certainly here in the United States. There's different states working toward it. In Canada, Ontario is starting in a very gentle, careful fashion. Quebec and Saskatchewan have both given out guidelines as to how they're going to do it. Quebec, which is 6 million people, and has had a fairly significant run with COVID, challenging it, especially in the care homes, because we're back in that older group. And there, they're talking about having children in elementary school, so the first 13, 14 years of life, they will be back to school probably May 11th. Okay, so I think it's important we start to think about how we can get back to normal. When I brought this up to my local Rotary Club in our online meeting yesterday, there was a couple people very frightened and almost anxious at me for even beginning to suggest it, because we were going to be putting people at risk. And so what I want to do is to have you start to look at the information that's coming out. We're getting a much better idea because now we have 2 months of information. So all of the fear issues that we created in the beginning haven't been as founded as we were worried about. And we know a lot more about it now. I mean, a great example, I've talked already about one of the studies in California, one of the studies in Iceland, but now they've done a major comparison between Norway and Sweden. Sweden did almost no lockdown. Their young children were still going to school up to, I think, age 16. And they do not have a statistically significant difference in deaths per capita from Norway. So those are two pretty similar countries in a lot of their, ideas and thinking. And so it's a nice example that it hasn't been quite the panacea we thought it might be with our distancing. There's a suggestion now that this is in our air conditioning. Mm-hmm. It's probably in our air to some degree. One of the challenges about COVID-19 is it's almost a nanoparticle size, so it's much easier for it to trip on through the air. So whether you're 6 feet away or 6 miles, it still happens, okay? Right. And that's why I think when we get enough numbers, all the numbers are coming in, there's 5 to 20% of people in the community already have COVID-19. I think their estimate in New York State is that 20% or 2.7 million already have it. So if we think we're not keeping it enclosed because it's already here, folks.
And sorry, just to take it back to if you're experiencing anxiety based on what we're saying, there is a difference between being mentally or just being prepared and going out and acting against the recommendations that are in place right now.
So we're not advocating to go out and become rebellious in your own right. We're asking you to listen to what's happening in your state, your province, what's being suggested, because they really vary as to what they're doing. And over time, the ones that have been fairly open about starting things out again, if they continue to do well, we'll hear about it and we need to listen to that. So I can only applaud the people that are already, looking at the numbers, looking at the data and deciding it's time to open things up. I don't think that they're being wrong in what they're doing. And, I'm hoping that we can get towards that sometime soon. Mm-hmm. And it's not just because I want to golf.
Yeah, exactly. And then using all of the recommendations that we've made in the last few videos to help prepare yourself. So using oxygen, using dietary recommendations, all of those different things to build yourself up so that you become more resilient as we do open back up.
And I've got my, little pulse oximeter with me today. We're going to turn it on and we'll measure it. The old phrase was when you get to cardiac arrest, first thing you should do is check your own pulse, because that's, indicative. If you're super fast in your rate pulse, then you're probably in adrenaline mode and you're probably not thinking too clearly. But it just came out in an article in the Irish Times, so that parts of Ireland are using the pulse oximeter as one of their indicators as to how people are doing. And it allows them nearly 24 hours awareness ahead of time rather than just an hour when people do all of a sudden badly and we thought they were doing okay. So pulse oximeter is still a very useful piece in it. Happily, I'm at 99 here at sea level, and I expect you're better, or every bit as good. But the pulse oximeter is still a useful tool, and it will be useful to you long term, because anytime you're worried you're having a heart attack or an asthma attack or any other variation in being unwell, check your pulse oximeter. If it's got a really high heart rate, you might be heading to the emergency room. If it has very low oxygen, you should do something about it. Okay? So we can all do. And the other tricky about things, you have to have warm fingers. So maybe your fingers cool, but it's going to come. So, keep it warm for a minute or two first and then try it again. So the other pieces, of course, in talking about that, it's part of aiming towards normalcy. So we have learned now that the virus mortality rate is somewhere between 0.05, 0.1, and in unusual cases, 0.2. So what has happened is we've got a much bigger denominator. When we only measured people that hit the hospital door, as they started to in Italy, for example, and then we measured the number of deaths, it was a super high rate because we were only looking at that almost 20% of the population that were very sick. But if you look at the whole population, it gets down much, much lower. It still isn't a good thing if you're one of those people, or you're in the high risk group because you're over 65. But if you look after yourself, this is probably no more injurious than a nasty flu, because we will lose large numbers, up to 60,000 per year in the United States, just from flu itself, which is influenza A and B. So let's move on from there and talk a little bit about glyphosate. Why? So I'm going to turn it over to Kristina. She's done a great preparation paper, and we'll follow that up with something on my website, drbillcode.com, so that you can get an idea about it. And I will talk a little bit about generalities. We'll have an individual case for you on Thursday, but why don't you kind of give us a capsule summary, please?
So glyphosate is a broad spectrum, non-selective, systemic herbicide, and you've likely heard of it. It's one of the main ingredients in Monsanto's Roundup and a number of other products as well. The reason it's of concern right now, and the reason we're bringing it up in these videos, is because it may play a role in some of these high risk factors for coronavirus. And it also just in general fills up your bucket. So if you think of total body burden, this is sometimes a phrase we use to describe how much your body can handle. So how many toxins are you holding? How much stress are you dealing with? All of these different things. Your body, everyone has a different limit as to what they can handle. And glyphosate is definitely going to be one of those things that is impacting your total body burden.
And I think the other important piece about that is we know more and more about glyphosate because it originated probably in the 70s. And the original way we used glyphosate was to clean out pipes. It was a plumber's tool because it chelated the minerals. So that's a key word, chelated the minerals so that they could reduce the scale or lining inside the pipes. And then probably inadvertently somebody threw what was left over on a group of thistles or weeds, and they all died. And they said, well, that's pretty cool. So not long after that, Monsanto had purchased the entity, patented it as a herbicide, and it's kind of moved on from there. It wasn't used as much, but by 1994, it was starting to go into very, very major use. It was initially used, of course, in genetically modified crops, and the original big ones were probably soy, cotton, corn, sugar beets. And many of these were being treated with Roundup because it would kill all the weeds except not that plant. And the premise has always been it only affects plants. Well, we've learned otherwise because it affects bacteria. So we'll get to that in a minute. So all of a sudden, we started to use a huge amount. And for the last 10, 20 years, it's been increasingly used as a desiccant or a drying agent. So now it's reckoned 90% of the wheat grown in Canada, the United States, is dried out with glyphosate so they can harvest it a few days sooner. And the only one of the main downsides of that is it's concentrated in the seeds, which is the piece we use, of course, of wheat and a few other grains. And consequently, it's dramatically increasing the intake of people. It's also being used often to harvest commercial potatoes, sweet potatoes, sugar cane. In fact, there's stories of it in the southern United States where it's extensively used in the sugarcane industry. The young men spraying it often go on to have kidney failure. Mm-hmm. The other big dramatic piece that I want you to truly understand is glyphosate, and not a huge amount. So if you're out in that 20 to 50 percentile, you're probably still having effect. It tends to shut down we call them P450 pathway enzymes, or CYP enzymes in the liver. And those are our number one cleanup detoxifiers for what we drink and eat. So consequently, now you've taken away one of the major detoxifiers. And that's why it's very critical for children. Children can't handle the toxins, you and I can. So if we shut their detoxification down with glyphosate or Roundup in their foods or in their water, all of a sudden, all toxins are an increased problem for them. Mm-hmm. So that means neurologic injury.
Yeah, well, it's going to drive pathology in a number of groups. And the way that it does drive the pathology is, number one, through microbial disruption. So glyphosate has also been patented as an antibiotic, so it does disrupt our microbiome. It's going to drive pathology through disrupting the CYP detox pathway, and it's going to drive pathology through chelating our minerals and taking them away from the processes that they would contribute to in our body.
And so, those are common ones that you're used to hearing: iron, selenium, zinc, and even iodine, probably. So all of a sudden you've now got a mix that will interfere with your optimal thyroid function. At the same time, it goes on, and it's particularly an issue also with the relative trace mineral, but very important mineral to us, manganese. Okay, so manganese is interesting, especially because glyphosate also interferes with bioproduction, right?
Exactly.
And when typically we put manganese that's excess in the body, it goes into the bile and on out through, with the stool out through the rectum. But if it cannot put it into the bile, then all of a sudden that individual has more gallbladder problems, higher risk of having a gallbladder removed. And when the manganese builds up in the liver, it finds an escape route. It takes the vagus nerve up to the brainstem. So the brainstem nuclei, and there it is a relative toxin on the brainstem nuclei and on the hippocampus. So it's implicated in memory, cognitive problems as well. At the same time, as Kristina mentioned, it affects the microbiome. It particularly aggravates leaky gut. Remember, we wanted to have a healthy gut wall, gut lining, because that's our big protection, because 70 to 80% of our immune system is the gut, along the gut lining. The lymph tissues are all therein. And these are really aggravated and made a problem. It's maybe one of the features that, I got along not too badly in life. I eventually realized I was gluten sensitive, and gluten sensitivity is probably going up also because of the presence of the messing up of the microbiome, because of the presence of glyphosate. So, we're going to talk about gluten in the future, but short story is gluten sensitivity is a bigger problem because of glyphosate.
Mm-hmm. And then just to tie it back to the manganese, so it's actually kind of paradoxical how the glyphosate will chelate manganese so that we have too little of it in some places, but then we have too much of it in other places like the brainstem. So one of the places that manganese is required is in the gut, and our gut microbes will use manganese to help protect themselves from oxidation, especially the lactobacillus species seem to do this. So when manganese is not available, they can't do that. they are less likely to flourish.
And there's one subset of bacteria do especially well in that scenario, and that's Pseudomonas. You've maybe heard of Pseudomonas aeruginosa. It's often there in the chronically ill, the chronic lung problems, think cystic fibrosis, COPD. And, 20% of lethal pneumonias are Pseudomonas, okay? So Pseudomonas, this is an example. If you poison a lot of the microbiome or use a lot of antibiotics, for example, then all of a sudden you're going to have a few that do well despite of it, okay? And so part of that group would be Pseudomonas is aggravated. And of course, if you're putting in that ongoing antibiotic, or if you use another antibiotic in addition to the glyphosate you're eating in your diet or in your water, all of a sudden there's many more bacteria killed in addition from the presence of the antibiotic itself, because 1 + 1 equals more than 2, unfortunately.
And then we also see in studies that with low dose long-term exposures to a single antibiotic, so say glyphosate in this case, we know it's patented as an antibiotic, that will drive antibiotic resistance.
Yeah, so it has a subset of those bacteria that can handle the antibiotic because we're chronically giving it. I mean, we've always said, and it isn't a great idea because we use a lot in growing animals faster, because if you kill off, and there's some subtleties in here I want you to hear, if we kill off some of the bacteria in the body, they gain weight faster and they become obese faster. So that's maybe a rosy thing if you're raising pork or beef or chicken, but it's not such a rosy thing if you're turning out obese individuals. And I think it's a piece of the obesity crisis that we've all, got or worried about.
Yeah, exactly. Some of the other pieces to glyphosate, so when we look at the products that contain glyphosate, they don't often tell you what the other ingredients are. So for example, if you look at Roundup or any of the Roundup products, they'll usually list glyphosate at 49% and then other ingredients as 51%. Well, they don't want you to know what those other ingredients are, but the fact of the matter is that all of those ingredients are acting synergistically. So glyphosate, when it's paired with certain other ingredients, will be even more potent and will increase the potency and bactericidal effects of the other ingredients.
And they've had to do this because some plants get very resistant to it. I mean, for more than a decade now, we've been hearing about 3-meter or 10-foot high pigweed happening in the Midwest. And consequently, we've had to add more things and use larger and larger amounts of glyphosate. But at the same time, they've now had permission, they've requested permission to bring back 2,4-D to add to it, or to bring back even Agent Orange to add to it. So all of a sudden, we're still on this stamp everything out mentality. It's almost a little bit like the germ theory principle, which I want us to move away from. I want us to move more toward a healthy terrain. And, that's the crisis that's happening where we're growing our food. Over time, this is almost sterilizing the soil because it lingers much longer than we thought it did. There was a very famous ad when I was back in probably the early 90s or so back in Saskatoon. It came initially out of New York State, was that Roundup was just as safe as table salt. And in fact, I had one of my friends who was working at the University of Saskatchewan in the agriculture department, told me this story. It was eventually verified to be incorrect, and eventually they had to retract it, but they used it for years, first of all, saying how safe it was. It is just not near as safe as we've suggested. It's now been accepted by WHO as being a probable carcinogen, and they will work toward making that probably a little stronger. Certainly, it's been banned in lots of parts of Europe for use, and many of the towns and cities in Canada and the United States have decided they're going to accept that concept of banning it for residential use. And these are all good steps forward, but some commercial areas are still using it in their weed control program. So this isn't ideal because it lingers, it injures the soil, because the soil microorganisms or microbiome is in a lot of ways parallel to the microbiome within our gut.
Mm-hmm.
It's very important to have that synergy working forward. Remember, it's our very biggest epigenetic factor. If we can improve our microbiome health and diversity, all of a sudden our good genes are turned on and our bad genes are turned off. A large number of them, maybe up to 20,000.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Well, this might be a good time to get to some of these questions that have built up. And there is one from last week's video. I just wanted to make sure I remembered to answer this question, but someone had asked if they have an allergy to soy, what can they use instead of nattokinase? And a good replacement would be serrapeptase. So there are studies showing that serrapeptase can also break down fibrin.
Yeah, so serrapeptase is one, and another one is lumbrokinase, which remember is the name Boloke, B-O-L-U-O-K-E. So any one of those three will be effective, and you will have some benefit from the general digestive enzymes, but those are the three specifically probably help break down fibrin the best. Because remember, that excess fibrin that's laying around, lining the endothelium or the lining of the blood vessels, will dramatically reduce oxygen transport. So that's another important reason we want to minimize it, because oxygen transport is really key in the presence of COVID-19.
Okay, next question. Kristina, can you comment about our city water containing chloramines and how drinking it can impair the immune system? So the last time I looked into this was 2 years ago, and at that point in time, there wasn't anything in the literature about the impact that chloramines might have, but I have kind of just personally lumped it into the negative group. The tricky part with chloramines is they can't be boiled off. And we don't have any data to show that they are removed by filtration, but I would imagine they would be, I'm guessing that they would be removed by certain filters. So if you use a reverse osmosis or Berkey filter or something like that.
The reverse osmosis probably is only the decent way that you'll remove them, because they're bound to them. And, you know, we know that they're there to reduce the bacteria within our water, of course. However, we do know that they will injure some of the bacteria within our microbiome. So if you're trying to optimize your microbiome well-being, and you know that that's pretty heavy duty in the area that you live in, which is pretty common in much of Canada, United States, and certainly in the major cities, then you would consider at least doing, you know, that filter in the fridge will reduce some of it, just the same as we've all learned long ago. You don't take ordinary tap water with chlorine in it, put it in and put your fish in it, because the fish die. What's that tell us? Okay, but if you leave it overnight, so that much of the gas chlorine moves off of it, then often they will tolerate it. Okay, but the only way to remove almost all of it is that reverse osmosis filter, $200 or $300 under your kitchen sink, and that's the only water that you drink of your household water.
And just for anyone who doesn't understand, chloramines are when chlorine binds to organic matter and they become chloramines. Okay. What foods are high in manganese? Many get anxiety from taking the supplement. So foods higher in manganese include leafy greens. And yes, it's preferable to get it from food if you can. Sometimes if people are getting anxiety from manganese, it could be because it's triggering dumping of copper.
Yeah. So, and manganese, it's an important trace mineral we all need, but when we get that feedback suggestion that it's increasing anxiety, then we have to try and tease out what else is going on at the same time. And remember, manganese isn't the only issue, because this affects and chelates virtually all minerals. So the ones who will be super affected are the ones who are already on a protein pump inhibitor, because that dramatically reduces iron absorption and other mineral absorption. So if you take the two together, you've got a real problem with mineral absorption. So even taking a multivitamin, multi-mineral probably won't solve your problem. And all of this is a little more aggravated because in the last 50, 100 years, we've dramatically reduced the amount of minerals in our soil because we haven't replaced them as you might on an organic farm with organic all-containing things. So often we're adding the fertilizers in the ordinary trio group, but we're not putting in many of the trace minerals.
Right. And then also just based on what we said a couple minutes ago about the manganese having too little in one area and too much in another area. So if someone is glyphosate toxic and they are trying to take a manganese supplement, you're more likely to experience anxiety because you're going to be sending that manganese up into the brainstem.
Yeah. Yeah. So it might be a really good clue in those things. And, so that's an extra piece to consider. For example, the point of return people. When they're helping people taper off medications, because all of these things tie in together. So, are there any others?
Okay, Bruce says, let's get it banned.
Yeah, well, I'm in, but I don't think it's going to happen overnight.
Oh, and then we covered Penny's question about the...
the alternative.
Yeah. Okay.
So the other interesting thing that's happening, many of you will have heard about non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. And I didn't realize it until we were reviewing the information right now. One of the contributing factors to non-alcoholic fatty liver disease is glyphosate. I've been on the drum before because we know it's also aggravated by high fructose corn syrup. And each of those, and it's now recognized that non-alcoholic fatty liver disease is passing and superseding in the population alcoholic fatty liver disease, not because alcoholism is any less frequent, it's just that this has become dramatically a secondary factor to injuring your liver. And remember, without your liver, you don't do well very long.
Mm-hmm. Another clue that you might be glyphosate toxic would be if you have kidney problems. So with the liver less able to process toxins, there's going to be more weight pushed onto the kidneys.
And one of the favorite ones to talk about that is arsenic poisoning. Now, arsenic's pretty significant. If you're around a coal-fired energy power plant within about a 25-mile radius, you're getting a reasonable amount of arsenic on your land and in your garden and all these pieces. So those people will be extra high risk, and arsenic is around. But arsenic is typically sorted by the P450 pathway in the liver. It can handle a reasonable amount. Can't handle over the moon amounts, of course. But when the liver is shut down as a detoxification agent, we're thrust back onto more emphasis on our kidneys and even on our lungs, because the lungs try and clean out the air that we breathe for the toxins in it. And that's why each of those three organisms are very key to have their glutathione base to them. And of course, regular glyphosate intake depletes your glutathione dramatically, and it's your number one inside the body antioxidant. And, as I talked about before, I traveled around for 4 or 5 years talking about the benefits of quality undenatured whey protein, and then other people will talk about N-acetylcysteine to enhance their glutathione. But you're not going to have much success enhancing it if you're already depleting it with either medications or glyphosate.
I don't know if we have anyone on this group with this type of intolerance, but glyphosate can drive oxalate intolerance as well. So if you are someone who has oxalate sensitivity or oxalate intolerance, this could potentially be something to look into that would help you.
Well, that's right. So we have another question around NAFLD, and I had to look that up a few years ago, but it means non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. And so this woman, Wendy, has a daughter who's challenged by that. And of course, she has a relative, sugar addiction and another product, which maybe it's high fructose corn syrup. I don't know.
I think she meant to say wheat product.
Okay, wheat product, fair enough. But the challenge in there, of course, is almost all sugar is really high in glyphosate, because 97% of sugar beets are GMO, genetically modified, and almost 100% of cane sugar is harvested now with that drying agent of desiccation from Roundup. Mm-hmm. So both of those are super high concentrated, and so is almost all wheat. Unless you're eating organic wheat, you haven't got a chance. And if you're eating organic wheat, then you have to hope that the water isn't contaminated with it. I think we're starting to realize that we may even get some contamination in the water cycle, in the rain cycle. But in the short term, at least we can hopefully look after it. Okay, we've got another question a couple of years ago about having an antibiotic 2 years ago. It was from Sherry. It happened to put her into acute liver failure. She was put on a transplant list. However, happily, she improved some, recovered, but to this day, her side is always sore. And with the damage she does have to fatty liver, how can we go on down? Is that related, and does that cause a secondary B12 anemia? Well, it could well, because the bacteria that are messed up and interfered with glyphosate and some antibiotics are the ones that produce most of our B12. Mm-hmm. And the other group, of course, are the vegans. They need B12 supplementation. And if there's any doubt about a low B12, you can, of course, get it measured. That isn't perfect because it measures every B12 type in the body. But the other subtlety I learned from a very brilliant woman, did her PhD in this area, was if the white blood cell count is at the lowest end of normal or slightly below normal, and your platelet count is down at the lowest end of normal, that's probably B12 deficiency and can be treated with B12 supplements. And you may be able to do that just with a vitamin B complex, okay, with the B12 in it. Some of you will not absorb that well enough, and then you'll need to go on to a sublingual cyano, ideally not cyanocobalamin, but better hydroxycobalamin or methylcobalamin,
exactly,
which are much easier for the body to use. But if cost is the entire issue, then more cyano, although I'm not a big fan of the cyanide molecule.
Exactly. And if that doesn't work, then potentially B12 injections.
But that will be aggravated in non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. So my recommendation when people have that diagnosis is minimize, and we're about to get to in a minute, you know, how you can minimize your intake, of course, of glyphosate, because there may be a couple things in there that you haven't thought of. But also, how can you make a difference to reducing other intakes? So, you know, the sugar issue is a big one. Try and stay away completely from high fructose corn syrup. It's got its own toxic components. Quite frankly, I virtually never drink soda pop or even tonic water made here in North America, Canada, United States, because I'll give Mexico credit, they use real sugar. But Canada, United States, it's almost always high fructose corn syrup. So I don't go there because it's not healthy for the liver or anything else. And it's one of the triggers likely of non-alcoholic fatty liver disease.
Right. We have one more question. We have one question from Lee. What about bee venom? I am a beekeeper who shares bees with Lyme patients.
Okay, so, you know, bee venom therapy has been around 30, 40 years, probably longer, I expect. And, you know, I've seen people with their osteoarthritis or rheumatoid arthritis or their lupus. Lyme is a relatively new one, but there seems to be an effect from the bee venom. And so we talked last time a little bit about PLA2, and I'm wondering whether it's making a somewhat of a difference in your PLA2 levels is maybe one of the reasons you're temporarily getting a break from the excess inflammation. Because almost all of these illnesses are excess inflammation in a part of the body or generalized throughout the body. So anytime we can reduce that, that may be what the bee venom therapy does. I can't recommend it overall because it hasn't really borne out, and in almost no one does it can persist after benefiting them for a year or two. There isn't too many that it's benefited their entire life. So I couldn't recommend it to people. I know you're a beekeeper, so I mean, it's a risk of the job. I get that. So it's a matter of determining that, finding it out.
Mm-hmm. Nutritional yeast is high in B12. My daughter uses this in her cooking. So actually, the nutritional yeast isn't high in the form of B12 that the body actually uses. So it's kind of like a catch-22 there, unfortunately.
Because remember, I had said to you that the B12, when we measured in the body, and there's quite a wide range, so I do measure from time to time because I find that some people, when they get a number, they're more inclined to believe my recommendations. I would much rather it be on the high side. there's any doubt at all about B12 deficiency, and because it can make a profound difference, and some people do not improve until they get into an injectable B12. Okay, so it's not something you want to be at the low end of normal for. So I would suggest, if you can possibly, get your white blood cell count and your platelet count, which happens in a coronary so-called complete blood count, and get the numbers. And if you're at the lower end of normal of platelets and the lower end of normal of your total white count, you've probably got B12 deficiency, and increase the intake, because it's incredibly safe for a large amount intake. The body tends not to absorb it if it has sufficient amount. And one of the ways you can enhance it, of course, is enhance the viability and diversity of your microbiome.
Kelly is asking, is there a test to determine your levels? And if they are high, how do you lower your levels? So yes, there is a test for your glyphosate levels. We tend to use the Great Plains test. Great Plains came up with it several years ago. I think they've done more of it than almost anyone. They now provide a test even for your water. But just one proviso with the water is use it on the time of year that you think the water might be highest. So this is when people are spraying. So if you did it right at the end of winter, it might be lower. That may not be the case. And it'll be interesting to get Dean's thoughts, because they tend to live with a reservoir or a dam source for water. And this, of course, is water that runs off. But there's a lot of Canada and the United States uses a dammed water. And of course, even if it isn't in the dam in time, if it's percolating slowly, gradually through the aquifer, it still can be elevated. So if you think it might be your water, you're not going to have very much success getting your local city or municipality to test your water. You're probably going to have to pay, send it to Great Plains Labs, Lenexa, Kansas. And you can get your own done. It's one of the tests you can do easily these days because it's done on the urine. I think it's 10 cc's of a morning urine. And they also now have 170 or 180 different other organic compounds that they can test for. So if you're worried you've had exposure to a certain group of herbicides, pesticides, or maybe you've been into paint work or these sorts of things, risk factors, then that's the place you can get them all tested. And it's all done on the urine. Mm-hmm. Wendy is saying, I think many people crave sugar products from the candida bacteria imbalance in their microbiome, sadly. Yes, so definitely your microbial balance can contribute to sugar and other cravings. So definitely working to balance your microbiome can help with sugar or other cravings.
And I've learned on the sugar craving or even the chocolate craving, because I'm a chocoholic, part of acceptance is recovery. But when I finally got my nutrition and diet much more sorted and I was more healthy, they tended to go away. And maybe a piece of that sometimes, I've agreed, is candida. And just to talk about candida for a moment, because most regular physicians don't have too much success accepting this high candida in the gut. So they will accept candida when they see thrush or white patches in your mouth. They will accept it when a woman has a vaginal discharge, cheesy type, consistent with yeast overgrowth. But the underlying, and often they will accept, a fungal problem if you've got the problem in your fingernails or your toenails, because that can be pretty graphic. And occasionally in a skin rash. You might be in the groin, might be any number of places, because that's a typical one for candida. But underlying that, I would like to suggest is the very vast majority of candida in the body is in the gut. It's warm, it's moist, it's got sugar components, all those pieces the candida needs. And when does it get over the wall? Because it's a normal piece of the microbiome. It's just when does it get over the wall when all the other ones in diversity has been repressed. And that's why almost everybody, certainly most of the women I ever looked after with vaginal discharge, or even the children with thrush, were either on a chemotherapy for their cancer or they were on an antibiotic for another purpose. One of the commoner ones, certainly in MS patients, is urinary tract infection. But when the other commensal or friendly so-called bacteria are diminished, all of a sudden something bursts forward, and candida is a common one, unfortunately.
Right. And all of that being said, if you suspect candida, don't go ahead and self-treat. Make sure that you actually get properly tested. So if you refer back to whichever video it was where we spoke to the future of testing, so not using culture-based testing, but using PCR-based testing, you can get tested for candida and see if it's there, because we do see quite a few people come through our clinic who have been self-treating for candida for a long time, and that's not even necessarily their problem.
And another way you can test for candida overgrowth and Clostridium particular overgrowth sometimes is the organic acid test, which is done at Great Plains, because you get an excess amount of arabinose, and that's a breakdown sugar product from candida. And that shows up high, and that can really indicate that there's an overgrowth. And the other one is Clostridia, and certain components of that can even affect mental function and give even psychogenic problems, not unlike schizophrenia symptoms, even though it may not be the full-born thing. So we've had another question from Warren about his B12 apparently is low according to his physician, and is that related to his multiple sclerosis or MS? And it could well be. There's no question that vitamin B12 deficiency can hugely mimic MS. So a good clinician will be checking out your folate, your B12, and your B6, or replacing them if they're unable to test them. Now, some places can test them. The organic acid test will test those for you, yes. And methylmalonic acid is a urine test, which you can do to confirm, and you can do that even in Canada in our labs. Methylmalonic acid in the urine can say yay or nay to B12 deficiency. B12 is incredibly safe to take. So if I was in those shoes and I have MS, I always make sure I have enough B12 in my system. I would much rather have at the highest number in the testing that they do rather than the lowest number. No hero points for a low B12. It's too big a factor. And remember, B12 deficiency may not even be reversible, but can mimic MS, all right? So it's one thing to have in your diet right from the get-go as long as you can. And if you've already got a diagnosis of MS, you're not going to do yourself any favors by being lean on B12.
Right. We have one question. I am allergic to seafood. Should I still try fish oils, or what else would you recommend? Can you tolerate algae oil?
So algae oil, which is the choice taken by, vegans because they don't want to use fish. And that's one opportunity because there's a pretty decent DHA containing oil. So that's one of the two parts. The two key parts of omega-3 oils in fish oils is EPA and DHA. And most of the research about the safety, the reduced, sudden cardiac death, and the reduced arrhythmias and the reduced inflammation come with fish oils, as opposed to some of the other krill oils and other things. So my favorite is still is still fish oil. And because almost all allergies, when we talk about fish oil and fish, are the protein-based problem, okay? Well cleaned up fish oil, and this, in my case, in what I'm giving for an example, would be Nordic Naturals or 2 or 3 other ones, because they have cleaned up their fish oils with CO2 extraction to take away the heavy metals and the other toxins that we've dumped into the ocean, okay? In the process thereof, and the process of a properly cleaned up fish oil, so that's not just straight salmon oil, which they squeezed out of the salmon and then sold you salmon in a can, but by getting that cleaned up, clean of protein oil, it's almost highly, highly unlikely that you're going to have a problem taking it, even though you might have sensitivity to fish.
Right. And then some other plant versions would be the walnut, the hemp, and the flax. But as we've mentioned before, your body has to convert the plant-based versions of omega-3s to the versions it can actually use. So you're going to have to take a lot more.
And some of us don't do that very well. Men convert 0 to 12%, and I can't tell looking at you whether 12% or a 0, but neither one is very good. And the same crisis comes up a little bit for women postmenopausal because the body seems to have a protection mechanism in its reproductive years. Women are better able to convert that omega-3 alpha linoleic acid down onto EPA and then onto DHA. So to cover the base best, take the EPA DHA, especially if you have a health issue that may benefit from omega-3s, then start with the larger amount. You may need 5 times as much as the regular daily amount to start to reverse some of these long-term needs that you've had developed.
Right. Kelly is asking, can the general public order these tests directly from Great Plains? So yes, you can order the tests yourself from Great Plains. If you're just ordering the glyphosate or any of their other toxin panels, I would say go ahead and do that. But if you order something like the organic acids test, there's definitely some interpretation that needs to happen there. So make sure you're working with a practitioner, someone trained in functional medicine or an integrative practitioner who can help you interpret those tests properly.
Yeah, and this is often might be a naturopath, a nurse practitioner, physician, osteopath, because they will understand those. And their preference is you list one when you send the test in. The other good thing about Great Plains is they will provide an interpretation to you included in the charge of the test. So they give you a printed out interpretation, but they also will provide a visit online or through the telephone to talk about those parameters. And the other interesting thing, just because we're talking about Great Plains at the minute, I talked about it because they're the only people at the moment that can do the urine testing on PLA2. And it's probably the PLA2 that's going up in the lungs, which is a small molecule, but it's measured in the urine, maybe the explaining factor to why, as the older you get, you produce more PLA2 in the lungs. And that might be one of the reasons that the elderly are doing much less well in the presence of COVID-19. So the only other corollary from that, Bill Shaw, who of course runs that lab, he's done a couple of fabulous videos. We attached it last time to the one talking about PLA2. He did say in that last webinar that I heard from him last week, by the 1st of May, they will have a blood test for antibodies for COVID-19, so both for IgG and IgM. Of course, it's in the process of being evaluated. Is it one of the ones to be accepted by the FDA? But I expect it will, because he does incredibly good work. And he reckons by the end of May, they'll be able to do the blood spot test, blood onto a paper, and then testing it for antibodies. So some of you will be wanting to know, do I have antibodies? I've had a friend of mine say he would pay $100 for the test. It's going to cost about $100 US to get it done. But that is in the pipeline, and that will give us a lot more explanation. And the hope is that when we get antibodies after we've had the actual illness itself, we probably will be antibody resistant to that group for a 1 to 2 years, or maybe longer. Happily.
Hopefully. So we have a question from Kelly. Doesn't excessive B12 for prolonged periods build up in the liver with potential negative effects?
Almost never not, happily, because as long as the liver is working well, it's cleaning out any of the excess molecules and tends not to reabsorb the B12 in the terminal island, the lower part of the small intestine. So the body has its own protective loops for that, because there's regularly B12 produced by our bacteria and what we eat. And if you look at the people that take in a high amount of B12, because maybe they're major carnivores or huge number of eggs, B12 buildup in the liver is highly unlikely. Now, if you're injecting it, some of the other components, maybe they're going to build up over time. But I've never heard of a liver toxicity problem from B12 alone. Happily.
Mm-hmm. Wendy says, I heard seal oil was better than fish oil, but I've never tried it. I've never heard of seal oil either. But again, I mean, with the omega-3s, you can also get those from grass-fed meat. So specifically, grass-fed meat is higher in omega-3s, not grain-fed meat.
And that's because the grasses, they don't have a lot of oils in them, but they're virtually all omega-3. And that's the advantage we have from parts of the plant kingdom. And because of the ruminants, the particular bacteria strains that are in the rumen or the multiple stomachs of the cow and the sheep, they are able to convert those into an omega-3 that's in the fat of the meat. And that's why grass-fed meat, which is virtually all we eat, is much healthier for you. So the other piece that fits along with that is trying to decide where you could get it with regard to seal oil. So I have heard about seal oil. There was a fellow who did some great research on it at the University in Newfoundland, and it probably has a lot of excellent components in it, but not everybody can get their head around eating it. I'm kind of one of the world experts on emu oil, which isn't a great source of EPA and DHA, so don't worry about that. But you start to learn all the other oils around the planet that are talked about. And seal, being a mammal and living in the ocean and eating fish that eat plankton, because plankton is the original origin of the omega-3s, just like plants are in the outside world for the cows and sheep. It's that storage and then that processing within the fish that goes up and into us, and the same happens in the seal.
Mm-hmm. Well, we only have 4 minutes left, and we didn't really get to our recommendations as to what to do if you have glyphosate toxicity.
Yeah. So why don't you start with those, and I can maybe fill in one or two more.
Okay, so number one, and probably the most obvious, is to eat an organic, chemical-free diet. So limit your exposure in the first place. Even better would be to meet the farmers who are growing your food if you can. So if you shop at the farmer's market, or if you can use a CSA or something like that, and then you can be even more confident that they are not using something like glyphosate. Avoid genetically modified foods. So these foods are designed to be used with glyphosate. So definitely if you are shopping at the grocery store and you're looking at the packages, make sure that it says non-GMO. Growing and cooking your own food, and definitely that's helpful for us in so many ways. Filtering your tap water, so making sure that you use a reverse osmosis filter or some other form of filter. I know there are some experts who can get into this more specifically to do with the filter. So Laura Adler, she's an environmental toxins expert, and she speaks to specific types of filters that will filter out certain things. Avoid living in areas with high use of glyphosate, and use sauna if you can.
Yeah, because sauna will help the body clean it up. And you first of all have to start bringing it in, stop bringing it into the body, and then the body will tend to clean itself up over time, but you can help it with the other methods. And we talked about GMO foods, but the advantage of organic is that will take away the people that desiccate their wheat and their potatoes and their sweet potatoes and their sugars, all of which are using a desiccant stage of Roundup or some equivalent with glyphosate in it. And consequently, you've got to avoid those if you're going to reduce the other. And if you live in an agricultural area, I would very frankly put a reverse osmosis filter under the sink so that all the water you drink in your household comes out of that single tap.
Now, beyond just preventing your exposure to glyphosate, there are things you can do to support the body to detoxify itself. So, I mean, on the one hand, you're going to want to support the areas of the body that are being affected by glyphosate. And then on the other hand, there are certain studies that we can look to that show us certain compounds that actually help to detoxify glyphosate. And some of those things would include humic and fulvic acid. So these are the compounds that actually make our soil sticky, but you can purchase them as a supplement. There's quite a few different supplements out there. There's Restore. There's a number of other ones that contain humic and fulvic acid. So that is one of the ones that helps to detoxify glyphosate. Second to that was actually just drinking sauerkraut juice. So that was found to be helpful. And then using activated charcoal as well. So definitely binders and anything that is rich in probiotics and live bugs to help your gut detoxify glyphosate.
So in summary, we've spent most of the session certainly on glyphosate, but it's very important because it's very doable. It's in everybody's purview and reach to work with it. the short story is it's going to take you away from eating most short order or fast food type places because they won't have looked after it. And tragically, parts of the world, particularly the United States, they supplement their soy and they supplement their corn growers, and consequently those things are cheaper. And that's why fast foods tend to be cheaper and taken in more when we don't have the dollars for them. But we've emphasized this time on glyphosate because it's a huge factor in the health of your microbiome. The diversity and health of your microbiome is probably the very biggest predictor of how your immune system is and how good a shape it's in, so it can be modulated, do its very best job of handling an outside the body infection like COVID-19. So we're going to start off on Thursday at 2:00, and we're going to have Dean Howcroft from Mollymook, Australia in New South Wales, and he will be our guest, and he'll talk a little bit about his MS journey, but also with regard to some of his glyphosate information. So thanks for joining us, folks. Hope you've had a good day. Be well and get ready to go back to normal.
And as always, don't forget to share this video with those in your community. That's all we can really ask, is that you share this information with as many people as you can.
And if you have friends or family without Facebook, send them to Dr. Bill Code, DrBillCode.com. Click on blog, and they're all listed there under YouTube, along with a number of blog or podcasts that we've done.
All right. And yes, Bruce disrupts the shikimate pathway in the microbiome, of course. Okay, bye for now.